Grant Lennox never thought he'd find himself standing in line at a pharmacy. Yet there he was, waiting for a prescription, feeling out of place. As a billionaire used to calling the shots and managing multimillion-dollar deals, waiting for a simple prescription felt surreal. He was used to his assistant handling these small tasks, but today things were different. His assistant, Claire, had sent a rushed text, something about a burst pipe or a sick child. So Grant decided to handle it himself. The neighborhood around him was calm, almost unnervingly quiet. It was the kind of place where independent bookstores and herbal tea shops dotted the street, with chalkboard signs offering today's specials. As Grant checked the time for the third time, feeling the tension grow, he couldn't shake off the odd sensation in the air. The buzz of the pharmacy was soothing, but something wasn't quite right. Just as he was about to check his phone again, a sound from outside grabbed his attention. It was a familiar laugh, small and breathless. Without thinking, Grant turned his head toward the sound. And there she was, Isabel, his ex-wife, the woman he hadn't seen in 7 years. She was sitting on a bench under the awning outside, comforting a child. As he stared at her, memories came rushing back, uninvited. Isabel hadn't changed much, still the same grace, the same warmth, but the boy beside her. That was something different. Grant's breath caught. The boy looked just like him, exactly like his childhood photos. Same hair, same eyes. One green, one blue. The resemblance was undeniable, and yet impossible. He blinked, convincing himself it was a trick of the light. But as he stood frozen, trying to make sense of it all, he couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling that this moment was far from coincidence. Without even realizing it, he walked out the door, leaving his prescription behind. Was it possible? Could that child be his son? Grant couldn't ignore the possibility, no matter how absurd it seemed. His mind raced with questions. But for now, the only thing that was certain was that this. Stay with us as we unfold this powerful and emotional journey that will change Grant's life forever. This is Acts of Kindness Stories. If you haven't already, make sure to like, subscribe, and ring the bell for more stories that touch the heart and bring light to the unexpected moments in life. Grant Lennox wasn't used to standing in lines, especially not for something as mundane as a prescription refill. Yet, here he was, pacing back and forth in a small pharmacy, clutching a paper ticket and feeling oddly out of place. His assistant, Claire, had sent a flurry of apologies earlier that morning, something about a burst pipe and a sick toddler. Grant didn't give it much thought. He'd handled this kind of errand before. Besides, it was a quick in and out. He could grab his blood pressure meds and be back in his office within minutes. Or so he thought. The neighborhood around him was quiet, eerily quiet. It felt like the kind of place where people knew each other's names, where independent bookstores stood proudly beside little cafes offering the coziest herbal teas. There was no rush, no noise. The faint smell of lavender and antiseptic hung in the air as Grant checked his watch for the third time. 20 minutes. This should have taken 10. He ran his hand through his hair, frustrated by the delay. The elderly man in front of him had forgotten his reason for being there. The cashier, kindly but distracted, was explaining side effects in a way that made Grant's fingers itch with impatience. But then something caught his attention. Laugh. Small, breathless. Familiar. He turned instinctively toward the noise. Outside, through the window, under the awning of the pharmacy, he saw her. Isabel. His ex-wife. Grant hadn't seen Isabel in 7 years. Not since their divorce. But some memories don't fade. Isabel hadn't changed much. She was still the woman he remembered, with the same soft smile, the same elegance, the same grace. She was leaning over a child, tucking a beanie over his head, her arm around his shoulders in a way that felt natural. Grant's stomach tightened. Boy. There was something about him that made Grant's heart race. The hair, the shape of his face, the tilt of his head. It all seemed so familiar. But it wasn't just that. It was the eyes. One was green, the other blue. Heterochromia. It wasn't common, but it wasn't rare either. Still, seeing it sent a shock through Grant. The child looked just like him. His breath caught. Could this be real? No, it couldn't be. He hadn't known Isabel was pregnant when they signed their divorce papers. He hadn't known that there had been a child in the picture at all. And yet, here he was, frozen, unable to tear his eyes away from the scene. He shook his head, trying to make sense of it. This had to be a coincidence. A freak accident of genetics. Still, he couldn't ignore the possibility. That child, that boy, could be his son. He didn't even realize he'd left the pharmacy until someone called his name. His prescription ready. He walked out without a second glance, his mind spinning. It wasn't until he reached his condo that the weight of what he'd seen truly sank in. Grant sat in his walk-in closet, the soft smell of cedar and dust filling the air as he shuffled through old boxes. He didn't know why he was looking for something specific, but his hands moved instinctively, pushing aside boxes until he found the one he was looking for. Mom's stuff. The box smelled like memories. Old school ID cards, faded birthday cards, and photos. Dozens of them. As Grant flipped through the images, one photo stopped him cold. It was a picture of him at 6 years old. His arms were folded proudly, a slight smile on his face. His mother had always said he looked like a cat in that photo, with his stubborn chin and crooked lip. He hated that picture. But now, looking at it again, something about the photo seemed different. He placed it beside the mental image of the boy he'd seen outside the pharmacy. The boy, Theo, had the same stubborn chin, the same crooked lower lip, the same cowlick near the temple. Grant's stomach turned. The resemblance was undeniable. Could it be possible? Could that child be his son? And if so, why hadn't Isabel ever told him? Was this a cruel joke, or was this real? For days, the thought gnawed at him. He couldn't ignore it. On the fourth day, Grant found himself back at the pharmacy. He wasn't sure what he expected, but when he walked inside, his heart skipped a beat. There she was again, Isabel. But this time she wasn't outside. She was inside the store, crouched beside Theo, her hand gently brushing his back as they looked over the vitamins. Theo seemed oblivious to the tension in the air, focused entirely on the gummy dinosaur vitamins in front of him. Grant's legs moved before he could stop them, taking him closer to the pair. Isabel saw him first. Her face tightened, the lines around her eyes showing a flicker of recognition. She didn't move, and neither did Grant. They stood there for a moment, the air thick with unspoken words. "Is this a coincidence?" Isabel asked, her voice tight with a mix of frustration and something else Grant couldn't quite read. Grant didn't answer at first. He glanced down at Theo, then back at Isabel. "What's his name?" he asked quietly. Isabel hesitated before responding, her voice barely above a whisper. "His name is Theo. He's 7. He's mine." Grant nodded, his chest tightening. "Mine too," he replied, the words feeling like a punch to the gut. The silence between them was deafening. Theo, unaware of the gravity of the moment, was still absorbed in comparing gummy vitamins, one flavor against the other. Isabel took a deep breath, and Grant watched her closely. She wasn't angry. There was no defensiveness in her posture, just something more resigned. "You knew," Grant said, his voice flat. "You knew you were pregnant when we signed the divorce papers." Isabel nodded slowly, her eyes not meeting his. "I didn't tell you," she said softly. "I didn't think you'd be able to handle it." Grant's mind was racing. He had thought he'd moved on from the pain of their divorce, but now, facing Isabel again, facing the truth of this child, everything came rushing back. He had never wanted to be a father. He'd been too focused on his work, on Lennox Innovations, to even consider it. Isabel had been right. He hadn't been ready. "You were right," she said quietly, almost as though reading his thoughts. "I couldn't risk bringing him into a world where you were still married to your company. I couldn't let him be raised by a man who didn't have time for anything other than spreadsheets and stock prices." Grant stood still, the words cutting deeper than he expected. He had been so consumed by his work that he hadn't even noticed what it was costing him. His marriage. His chance at fatherhood. "You erased me," he said quietly, the pain in his voice betraying the anger he felt. "You erased me from both your lives." Isabel's eyes flickered with something. Guilt, perhaps, or maybe regret. "I didn't want to. But you were gone long before I filed for divorce, Grant. And Theo deserved better than someone who was never really there." There was a long silence. Theo looked up, finally noticing the tension between them. He smiled and waved, then returned to his gummy vitamins, as if nothing in the world could be more important than choosing the right flavor. Grant's heart swelled with something he couldn't quite name. "I want to get to know him," Grant said, his voice quieter this time. Isabel didn't reply right away, but after a moment, she gave a single nod. "We're here every Tuesday morning." He likes the pterodactyl-shaped vitamins. Grant watched as Theo bounced over to the counter, eagerly placing the gummy vitamins in their basket. The weight of the moment lingered between them. Grant knew this was just the beginning of something that could never be undone. The following days were a blur of medical research, late-night calls with biotech connections, and a relentless pursuit to understand everything about mitochondrial myopathy, the rare condition Theo had. He wasn't sure where this journey would take him, but one thing was clear. Grant was no longer focused solely on his empire. He had a son now, a son who needed him in ways he had never imagined. Isabel had made her decision. She had chosen to protect Theo. Now, Grant had to prove that he wasn't just a distant corporate executive. He had to show up. He had to be there. For Theo. For Isabel. Days turned into weeks. Theo's condition fluctuated, but Grant showed up every time. He spent time with him, learning about his favorite cartoons, his love for space, and his need for careful pacing. Theo was brilliant despite his illness. And Grant began to see that what Theo needed most wasn't money or resources. It was a father. Someone who would show up when it mattered. Their connection grew bit by bit. But every day there was a new challenge. A new question. Could Grant truly be the father Theo needed? Or was he too late? Grant and Isabel's relationship had shifted, like the pieces of a puzzle finally finding their place. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic moments. It was the small, everyday actions that spoke volumes. Grant began to understand what it meant to truly show up, not as a businessman, but as a father. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew that showing up, being present, and learning how to care for Theo in ways that went beyond his usual world of deadlines and corporate pressures was the first real step toward redemption. The week before their return to the hospital, something small but significant happened. Theo, still weak from his treatment, had asked Grant to stay after school for the first time. No longer just a request, it was an invitation. "Gee," Theo said with his signature dry humor, "I think I'm going to need a snack after school. You should be prepared." Grant smiled, nodding. It wasn't about the snack, of course. It was about the fact that Theo wanted him there. And for the first time, Grant realized how much he had missed in all those years. And so he stayed. For the first time in his life, Grant wasn't running from something. He wasn't caught up in endless meetings or drowning in spreadsheets. He was sitting across from a 7-year-old boy, and somehow, that felt more meaningful than any business deal he had ever closed. With each passing day, Grant grew more convinced that family, true imperfect family, was where the real work lay. That day, as they sat together on the couch, Isabel walked by, looking at them both. A smile flickered on her face, something real, something unspoken. She didn't have to say anything. She knew, and so did Grant. Grant wasn't going to fix everything overnight. Theo's journey was still uncertain, and the road ahead would have many challenges. But what he now understood was that sometimes, being there, even when the world expected you to be somewhere else, made all the difference. Theo, now calling him G with growing affection, had a future that was filled with possibilities. Not because of the money or the resources Grant could offer, but because of the bond they were building. A bond that wasn't defined by wealth or status, but by time spent together, trust built slowly, and love that didn't ask for anything in return. As Theo's treatment progressed, so did their understanding of what it meant to be a family. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was raw. It was everything Grant had missed. And in those quiet moments, as he watched Theo grow stronger, Grant knew that every moment spent with his son was the most valuable thing he had ever done. Not for the headlines, not for the success of his company, but for Theo. This was no longer just a story of a billionaire trying to find redemption. This was a story of a man learning what it truly meant to be a father. If you've been moved by this story and believe that love, redemption, and second chances matter, please don't forget to like, share, and leave a comment below. We want to hear your thoughts. And if you're new to Acts of Kindness stories, make sure you subscribe and help us reach 10,000 subscribers. We share real, heartfelt stories that remind us all of the power of human connection. Join us and be part of this incredible journey. Let's keep spreading kindness, one story at a time.